North Carolina is a place known for its green countryside, rolling hills, military pride, and towns that carry both the calmness of small-town America and the intensity of military life. Among its most notable landmarks is Fort Bragg, one of the largest military installations in the United States. With thousands of soldiers stationed there, the area around Fayetteville is full of young men and women who dedicate their lives to service, discipline, and duty. But beneath that disciplined exterior, the surrounding community is also dotted with bars, nightclubs, and social spots where soldiers go to relax, celebrate, or sometimes to escape. It is in this environment that the tragic story of Kelli Bordeaux began. Kelli Marie Bordeaux was just 23 years old in 2012, and she represented the very spirit of youth, ambition, and hope. She was originally from St. Cloud, Florida, where she grew up in a loving, close-knit family. Her friends often described her as cheerful, ambitious, and fiercely independent. Growing up, she wasn't the kind of person who simply accepted what life gave her. She worked for what she wanted. She dreamed of becoming part of something bigger, of contributing to something meaningful, and eventually her path led her to the United States Army. Kelli had enlisted as a combat medic and medical specialist. In 2011, she was stationed at Fort Bragg, a sprawling military base in Fayetteville, North Carolina. For her, the Army wasn't just a career, it was a calling. She wanted to help people, to be part of a community where her skills and dedication could make a difference. Colleagues remembered her as a woman who combined professionalism with warmth. She took her responsibilities seriously, but she also made time to laugh, to connect, and to bring joy to those around her. Life at Fort Bragg, however, wasn't only about work. Like many young soldiers, Kelli also enjoyed her time off. Fayetteville's nightlife offered a variety of spots where service members went to dance, drink, and unwind after long days of training or missions. For Kelli, this social life was both an escape and a way to feel normal in a world where stress and discipline ruled every waking hour. At the time of her disappearance, Kelli was married to Mike Bordeaux, her high school sweetheart. They had tied the knot before her deployment to Fort Bragg, and though their relationship began with love and promise, cracks were already forming. Living apart due to her military assignment placed a strain on their marriage. Reports later revealed that Kelli had confided in friends about her marital struggles. She longed for stability, but it seemed increasingly clear that her relationship with Mike might not last. This left her emotionally vulnerable, navigating both the pressures of her military career and the uncertainty of her personal life. By early 2012, Kelli was trying to balance these struggles. She had her friends at Fort Bragg who cared for her deeply, and she often joined them for nights out in town. One such spot was a bar called Froggy Bottoms, a small, somewhat run-down establishment in Fayetteville. The bar wasn't glamorous, but it had become a popular gathering place for young soldiers. Cheap drinks, loud music, and familiar faces made it a regular weekend destination for many stationed at Fort Bragg. But Froggy Bottoms also attracted a rougher crowd, people who lived on the fringes, people who weren't connected to the military, and people with darker pasts. For Kelli, it was just another place to relax, but in truth, it was also a place of danger. On the evening of Friday, April 13th, 2012, Kelli decided to join her friends for a night out. It was springtime in North Carolina, the weather was warming, and the weekend energy filled the air. Soldiers gathered in their usual spots, ready to forget about their responsibilities for just a few hours. Kelli, always lively and upbeat, fit right in. She laughed, talked, and danced, soaking in the atmosphere at Froggy Bottoms. No one could have imagined that this ordinary night out would be her last. At the bar that night, another figure was present, Nicholas Holbert. At 25 years old, Holbert was a familiar face around Froggy Bottoms. He worked odd jobs there as a handyman and sometimes as a DJ. But beneath the surface, Holbert carried a deeply troubling history. He had grown up in foster care, lived a troubled childhood, and developed into a man who drifted on the edges of society. Most importantly, Holbert was a registered sex offender, a fact that most of the bar's regulars didn't know or perhaps ignored. He was the kind of person who blended into the background, always around but never really noticed, until circumstances forced him into the spotlight. That night, as Kelli enjoyed herself with friends, she crossed paths with Holbert. They weren't close friends, but acquaintances who had seen each other at the bar before. Holbert, noticing Kelli, struck up small conversations and hung around the group. As the night grew later and the drinks kept flowing, Kelli eventually decided it was time to leave. She wanted to go home to her apartment nearby in Fayetteville, but she didn't have her own ride, and that's when Holbert stepped forward. He offered to give her a lift, claiming it was no problem. To many, it might have seemed like a harmless gesture, a simple ride home from someone who appeared friendly enough. Kelli, perhaps tired from the night, agreed. What no one knew was that this seemingly small decision, to accept a ride from Holbert, would be the most dangerous choice of her life. It was the early hours of Saturday in April 14, 2012, when Kelli Bordeaux left Froggy Bottoms with Nicholas Holbert. Surveillance cameras captured Kelli leaving the bar, looking composed and calm, unaware of the danger she was stepping into. Holbert walked beside her, casual and unassuming, as though nothing was out of the ordinary. Together, they disappeared into the night. The next morning, when Kelli didn't show up for duty at Fort Bragg, alarm bells immediately rang. In the Army, failing to report to duty wasn't just unusual, it was unthinkable. Kelli was known for her discipline, her punctuality, and her sense of responsibility. Her absence was a glaring red flag. Fellow soldiers tried calling her phone, but there was no answer. Messages went unread, and her silence became more and more troubling. By the afternoon, the concern escalated into fear. Her friends knew something was terribly wrong. This wasn't the kind of woman who disappeared without explanation. She was reliable, loyal, and deeply committed to her role as a medic. Within hours, a missing persons report was filed. The Fayetteville Police Department, in cooperation with military investigators, launched a search. They began retracing her steps, asking questions, and piecing together the events of that Friday night. The investigation quickly led them back to Froggy Bottoms. Witnesses confirmed that Kelli had been there, enjoying the evening with friends. But the key detail was chilling. She had left with Nicholas Holbert. Suddenly, Holbert wasn't just a background figure anymore. He was the last known person to see Kelli alive, and investigators knew that made him their primary focus. As detectives dug into Holbert's past, they discovered the disturbing truth. He wasn't just a harmless bar worker, he was a registered sex offender with a criminal history that painted him as dangerous. Alarmingly, Holbert had a history of targeting vulnerable individuals, and his pattern of behavior suggested he was capable of violence. The fact that Kelli had been alone with him was deeply troubling. By the end of that first day, the search for Kelli had intensified. Her family in Florida was notified, and within hours, her disappearance made headlines across the state. A young Army nurse vanishing without a trace after a night at a local bar was a story that gripped the public's attention. Friends, family, and complete strangers came forward to help. Search parties were organized, flyers were distributed, and the community rallied together in hope of finding her safe. But behind the scenes, investigators were already preparing for the worst. Experience told them that a disappearance like this, especially involving a young woman last seen with a man like Holbert, rarely ended well. Still, in those early days, there was hope. Hope that maybe Kelli had simply gotten lost, or hurt, or gone off with someone, and would soon return. For her family, her fellow soldiers, and her community, that hope was all they had to cling to. But as hours turned into days and days into weeks, the grim reality of the situation began to unfold. And so began the haunting case of Kelli Bordeaux, a woman whose dedication, kindness, and spirit deserved far more than the fate that awaited her. The disappearance of Kelli Bordeaux was not just another missing persons case. It quickly became a matter of national concern, partly because of who she was and where she came from. Fayetteville, North Carolina, already carried the reputation of being a military town. Fort Bragg, one of the largest military installations in the world, was home to thousands of soldiers, medics, officers, and their families. Within this tightly knit military community, people noticed when one of their own suddenly went silent. On the morning of April 14, 2012, when Kelli did not show up for duty at Fort Bragg, the alarm bells began ringing almost immediately. The Army is not like a civilian workplace where someone can miss a shift and explain it later. Punctuality, attendance, and accountability are non-negotiable. For Kelli to simply not appear was unthinkable. This was the very woman who prided herself on discipline, on being present and prepared. Her absence was the first signal that something was deeply wrong. At first, her friends and fellow soldiers tried calling her phone. It rang and then went to voicemail. They reached out to her roommate, who had not seen her since the previous night. The details slowly pieced themselves together. She had gone out to Froggy Bottom's bar. She had been drinking. She was last seen leaving with a man named Nicholas Holbert. That was the thread investigators would begin to follow. By that evening, the Fayetteville Police Department had been notified, and soon after, the case was escalated due to Kelli's military status. Missing soldiers often prompt immediate attention, not only because of the personal stakes, but also because of the larger implications for military safety and morale. Meanwhile, her family back in Florida was gripped by fear. Kelli's mother, brother, and sister all knew she was too responsible to simply disappear. This wasn't like her. She wasn't the type to run away, to vanish without telling anyone. To them, the silence meant only one thing. Something had happened. The investigation began with Froggy Bottoms itself. Detectives interviewed bar staff, patrons, and anyone who had seen Kelli that night. Witnesses recalled her as being friendly, smiling, and talking with several people. Some remembered the man she left with, thin, tattooed, wearing casual clothes, someone who looked rough around the edges. That man was quickly identified as Nicholas Holbert. Holbert at the time was homeless. He lived in a tent in the woods near the bar, occasionally helping out with odd jobs. He was already known to police because of his prior criminal record. Most disturbingly, he was a registered sex offender, convicted years earlier for an offense involving a minor. The idea that such a man was the last person seen with a young Army medic immediately raised every red flag possible. Detectives tracked him down within a day. Holbert admitted that he had been with Kelli. He even admitted that he had given her a ride. But his story was carefully constructed. According to him, he had dropped Kelli off safely at her home and had gone back to his campsite in the woods. He insisted he had no idea what happened to her afterward. It was a story that seemed shaky from the start, but without evidence, investigators couldn't simply arrest him. They searched his tent, his belongings, his truck, but nothing conclusive turned up. Still, suspicion clung to Holbert like a shadow. While police investigated, the community mobilized. Search teams fanned out across Fayetteville and the wooded areas surrounding Froggy Bottoms. Soldiers, civilians, and volunteers combed through fields, creeks, and abandoned buildings. Flyers with Kelli's photo were posted everywhere. Her bright smile and uniform portrait staring back from telephone poles, shop windows, and community boards. National media began to cover the story, turning Kelli's disappearance into a headline across America. Military families related instantly. Here was a young woman who had sworn to protect her country, now seemingly lost to violence. For weeks, the search continued. Every lead was followed, every tip checked, but no trace of Kelli emerged. Meanwhile, investigators kept circling back to Holbert. His story had holes. Phone records didn't line up perfectly with what he claimed. Surveillance cameras showed inconsistencies. Witnesses contradicted his version of events. But without a body, without physical evidence, it was nearly impossible to prove murder. Holbert, for his part, carried on in a strangely casual manner. He did not flee town. He did not confess. He lived as though nothing extraordinary had happened, returning to his routines around the bar in the woods. To many in Fayetteville, this behavior only deepened the unease. The Army, meanwhile, honored Kelli's absence with a growing sense of dread. Each day that passed made it less likely she would return alive. Fort Bragg soldiers joined searches in their off hours, determined not to let one of their own be forgotten. Candlelight vigils were held, prayers offered, tears shed. Kelli's family traveled to North Carolina, speaking to reporters, pleading for answers. Her sister in particular became a voice for her, passionately describing Kelli's character, her dreams, and her innocence. They begged anyone with information to come forward. The case dragged on through April, May, and into the summer. Leads came in, but most fizzled out. Tips pointed to wooded areas, abandoned sheds, nearby rivers. Dogs sniffed for remains, helicopters scanned overhead, but the earth kept it secret. Behind the scenes, detectives kept pressing Holbert. They questioned him repeatedly, always circling back to that night. They asked him to retrace his steps, to explain his movements. They checked his alibis, tore apart his vehicle, tested soil samples from his tires. The circumstantial evidence was heavy, but again, it wasn't enough. The turning point would not come immediately. For nearly 2 years, the case of Kelli Bordeaux remained unresolved. Her family lived in agony, trapped between hope and despair, never knowing whether to grieve or to believe she might still walk through the door. But the police never forgot, and neither did the army. In 2014, a breakthrough would finally come, one that would shatter the lies and reveal the dark truth of what had happened on that April night in 2012. For 2 years, the disappearance of Kelli Bordeaux remained an open wound in Fayetteville, North Carolina. Her absence lingered like a ghost at Fort Bragg, where soldiers carried her memory in silence each morning they put on their uniforms. At Froggy Bottoms, the little bar where she was last seen alive, locals spoke her name in hushed tones, knowing that whatever had happened to her that night had stolen not only a young medic's future, but also a piece of the community's innocence. The investigation had not stopped. Detectives never let go of their prime suspect, Nicholas Holbert. Time and again, they revisited his story, probing for cracks, testing his patience. Holbert's insistence that he had dropped Kelli safely at her home never sat right with anyone. Investigators knew in their bones that he had lied. The problem was proving it. By 2014, the case had grown cold in the eyes of the public, but law enforcement was quietly working behind the scenes. The Fayetteville Police Department, alongside Army CID and the FBI, remained committed. They couldn't move forward with an arrest without a body. They needed physical evidence, something undeniable, something that would tie Holbert to a crime that, for 2 years, remained technically unsolved. That year, fate finally shifted. Detectives decided to press harder. Holbert, already on the radar for violating probation and drifting through life in his ragged, unstable way, was vulnerable. They cornered him with questions, showing him the weight of the evidence they had collected. The pressure began to chip away at his defenses. Finally, the breakthrough came. Nicholas Holbert confessed. It wasn't quick, and it wasn't clean. At first, Holbert tried to maintain his story, but as detectives bore down on him, presenting inconsistencies, reminding him of Kelli's family's pain, he crumbled. He admitted that on the night of April 14th, 2012, after leaving Froggy Bottoms with Kelli, he did not drive her home. Instead, he took her to the wooded area near his campsite. There, in the darkness of the trees, he assaulted her. And then, whether out of fear she would report him or out of sheer cold-blooded cruelty, he killed her. The confession poured out in grim detail. Holbert described how he had struck Kelli, beaten her, and eventually ended her life. He admitted to burying her body in a shallow grave not far from his tent. For 2 years, Kelli's remains had lain hidden in the dirt, just yards from where Holbert continued to live, drink, and work odd jobs. The horror of that revelation was nearly unbearable. To know that search teams had combed through those same woods, that soldiers and volunteers had walked within reach of her resting place, only to miss her by a matter of steps. It broke the hearts of those who had never stopped looking. On a gray day in May 2014, detectives, forensic experts, and search teams returned to the site Holbert described. He led them into the woods, through the trees, to the very spot where he had concealed her. With shovels and careful hands, they began to dig. Slowly, pieces of her clothing emerged, fragments of her life now reduced to evidence. And then, the skeletal remains of Kelli Bordeaux were unearthed. The search was over. The hope, slim as it had become, that she might still be alive, dissolved forever. Her family received the devastating confirmation they had dreaded but needed. Kelli was gone, and her fate had been crueler than anyone could have imagined. For the community, the discovery was both a tragedy and a strange relief. The uncertainty had finally ended. The endless waiting, the vigils, the unanswered questions, they had all found their conclusion in a shallow grave in the woods of Fayetteville. Holbert, meanwhile, faced the weight of his crimes. His confession sealed his fate. He was charged with first-degree murder, among other crimes, and prepared to face trial. But in 2015, rather than endure a jury's judgment, Holbert took a plea deal. He pled guilty to second-degree murder and first-degree kidnapping. The plea ensured that Kelli's family would not have to sit through a long, harrowing trial filled with graphic testimony and the defense's inevitable attempts to cast doubt. The sentence was heavy: life in prison. Holbert would spend the rest of his days behind bars, the woods that once sheltered him replaced by the cold walls of a penitentiary. For many, the punishment seemed appropriate, though no prison term could ever restore the life he had stolen. When the sentencing was read, Kelli's family spoke. They described their pain, their memories of her laughter, her dedication to her career, her dreams of helping others. They spoke of birthdays missed, of the empty chair at family gatherings, of the enduring grief that would never fade. And yet, in their words, there was also a plea for remembrance, that Kelli not be defined solely by the manner of her death, but by the brightness of her life. The military community mourned deeply. At Fort Bragg, soldiers held memorial services, honoring her not as a victim, but as a comrade. They remembered her professionalism, her kindness, her sense of humor. Her uniform, folded and displayed, became a symbol of sacrifice, not on the battlefield, but in the very community she had trusted. The broader public reflected too. Kelli's murder raised painful questions about safety, about the risks faced by young women in military towns, about the presence of predators like Holbert who slipped through the cracks of society. It was a reminder that service members, despite their strength and discipline, are not immune to the dangers of the world around them. In Fayetteville, Froggy Bottoms closed its doors not long after. The little bar where Kelli had spent her final hours became a place no one wanted to remember. The woods where she was buried grew quiet again, though for those who knew the story, they would forever hold a haunting significance. For Kelli's family, the journey did not end with Holbert's imprisonment. Grief has no timeline, no neat conclusion. Her mother, her siblings, her loved ones carried her memory forward, determined to honor her spirit in ways Holbert could never touch. They spoke her name in interviews, kept her story alive in hopes that others would learn from it, and clung to the love she had given them during her short life. And so, the truth was finally unearthed. The story that had begun with a bright young woman chasing her dreams ended with a cruel act of violence in a grave in the woods. Yet through the pain, there remained resilience, the determination of her family, the commitment of her fellow soldiers, the dedication of investigators who refused to give up. Kelli Bordeaux's story is not only about tragedy, but also about the refusal to forget, the demand for justice, and the enduring power of memory. She was more than a victim. She was a medic, a sister, a daughter, a friend, a soldier. And though her life was cut short, her legacy remains, carried by those who loved her and by all who now know her story. When Nicholas Holbert finally sat down with investigators in 2014, 2 years after the disappearance of Kelli Bordeaux, there was no denying the weight of the truth that was about to unfold. The police had always suspected foul play, and many had suspected Holbert early on, but until now there had been no hard evidence linking him to the crime. That changed when Holbert agreed to talk, and what he revealed was the horrifying end to a story that had gripped the Fayetteville community for years. Holbert explained to detectives that on the night of April 14, 2012, after leaving Froggy Bottom's bar, Kelli had gotten into his truck. He told investigators that he had driven her not directly home, as she had expected, but to a wooded area just outside the city limits. According to him, the two argued in the vehicle, and the confrontation turned violent. He admitted to striking Kelli and ultimately killing her in that isolated location. What followed was an attempt to erase what he had done. He dragged her body into a heavily wooded area and concealed it beneath brush and debris, believing that the dense forest would hide his crime forever. For 2 years, that shallow grave had held the remains of a young woman who had once been full of life, dreams, and potential. Her family and friends had lived in torment during those long months, hoping against hope that she would somehow be found alive. But Holbert's confession made it clear. Kelli had never made it home that night, and she never would. With Holbert's cooperation, investigators were led to the site where he had dumped Kelli's body. The search team moved cautiously through the woods until they reached the spot Holbert had described. There, beneath layers of dirt, branches, and decayed foliage, they discovered what they had feared: human remains. The medical examiner would later confirm that the remains belonged to Kelli Bordeaux. For her family, the news was shattering. Kelli's mother, Jonna Henson, had prayed every day for her daughter's safe return. Even as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, she held on to hope. The discovery of Kelli's remains ended that hope, replacing it with a different kind of grief. The grief of knowing that her daughter's final moments had been filled with fear and violence. The Army community at Fort Bragg was equally devastated. Kelli had been not just a soldier, but a friend, a sister, and a caregiver. Fellow service members remembered her as the young medic who had always been ready with a smile, someone who wanted to help others. The idea that her life had been cut short in such a brutal and senseless way hit the community hard. Candlelight vigils were held, and soldiers spoke openly about the pain of losing one of their own. For prosecutors, Holbert's confession was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. They now had both a confession and the physical evidence of Kelli's remains, tying him directly to the crime. In May of 2014, Holbert was formally charged with the murder of Kelli Bordeaux. He faced the possibility of the death penalty, but in the end, prosecutors struck a deal. Holbert would plead guilty to second-degree murder and kidnapping in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. During his court appearances, Holbert appeared detached, almost emotionless. To many observers, it was as though the gravity of what he had done never fully sank in. The courtroom was filled with Kelli's family, who listened in silence as the man who had stolen their daughter's life was brought to justice. When the judge handed down Holbert's sentence, it was clear that he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. He was sentenced to a minimum of 38 years in prison, with no possibility of parole until he had served decades behind bars. For Kelli's family, it was not enough. It could never be enough, but it was something. At least now there was certainty. At least now there was justice. The sentencing brought some closure, but it could not erase the pain. For Kelli's family, the years after her death were marked by grief and remembrance. Her mother spoke often about her daughter's kindness, her beauty, and her dreams of building a future. Kelli had wanted to help people through her work in the military, and she had believed in serving something greater than herself. That future had been stolen, and her family would never forget the void her absence left behind. The Fayetteville community also struggled with the loss. For many, the case had been a chilling reminder that danger could lurk even in familiar places. Froggy Bottoms, the bar where Kelli had spent her last night alive, eventually closed its doors, forever linked with the memory of the young soldier who vanished after a night of fun with friends. Locals spoke about how the case had changed the way people looked at safety, especially for young women going out alone at night. The Army, too, reflected on the tragedy. Discussions about the safety of service members outside of base became more prominent. Fort Bragg implemented new outreach programs to help soldiers make safer choices when they went out, and commanders reminded troops about the importance of looking out for one another. Kelli's story became part of training sessions, a tragic example of how quickly a night out could turn into a nightmare. Holbert, meanwhile, faded into the background of the prison system. Locked away and stripped of the freedom he once had, he became just another inmate with a number. But for those who remembered Kelli, he was never just an inmate. He was the man who had taken a young woman's life and destroyed countless others in the process. Even years later, the memory of Kelli Bordeaux continues to resonate. In 2017, on the 5th anniversary of her death, her family and friends gathered at a memorial service to celebrate her life. They shared stories of her laughter, her determination, and her caring spirit. They also spoke about the importance of keeping her memory alive, of making sure that others knew who she had been, not just how she had died. In a broader sense, the case of Kelli Bordeaux serves as a stark reminder of vulnerability and trust. Kelli had gotten into Holbert's truck believing she would be driven home safely. Instead, she had been led into danger. It was a tragic lesson about the risks of trust, and one that her story continues to teach long after her death. As the years pass, the pain has not lessened for those who love Kelli, but they take comfort in remembering the light she brought into the world. Her name lives on, not just in news headlines or court documents, but in the hearts of her family, her fellow soldiers, and the community that mourned her. In the end, the story of Kelli Bordeaux is not just the story of her death, but the story of her life, a life that was vibrant, compassionate, and full of promise. Though she was taken far too soon, her legacy continues to inspire. And while justice was served in a courtroom, the real justice lies in remembering Kelli not as a victim, but as the remarkable young woman she was. Her story is a haunting reminder that evil often hides in plain sight, but it is also a testament to the resilience of love and memory. Kelli's family carries her spirit forward, proving that though violence may take a life, it can never erase a legacy. If you found Kelli's story as haunting and powerful as we did, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell icon so you never miss our next deep dive into true crime. Share this video with others who follow stories of justice and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Stay safe